Musket fire crackles through the blue mountains of Jamaica. White smoke rises between the trees like war ghosts. A British soldier stumbles in the red mud, his scarlet uniform now stained with blood and earth. His breath comes in desperate gasps as he tries to reload his weapon with trembling fingers. "Where are they?" screams Sergeant Matthews, spinning his musket in all directions. The jungle responds only with the sound of rain beating on broad leaves and the distant sound of an African drum. The rhythm is hypnotic, threatening, like the heartbeat of a giant beast. Suddenly, an arrow cuts through the air and embeds itself in a tree trunk, inches from the soldier's head. He looks up and sees a small figure perched on a high rock, a black woman, wrapped in colorful cloth, her eyes glowing like embers. Nanny raises her right hand and makes a sharp gesture. Hell breaks loose, traps explode everywhere. Sharpened stakes sprout from the earth like dragon teeth. Rocks roll down the mountain, crushing soldiers who run in panic. The air fills with screams in languages the British don't understand. Yoruba, Akan, Twi, war words from the ancestors. "The land is ours." Nanny's voice echoes through the rocks, cutting like a blade. She leaps from the stone with the agility of a panther and disappears into the dense vegetation. Soldier William Thornton, only 16 years old, sees his shipmate fall into a thorn trap. Blood spurts like a red fountain. He turns to run, but a rope lassos around his neck. The last thing he sees before fainting is the face of a woman who could be his grandmother, but who looks at him as if he were a demon. "You came looking for slaves," she whispers in perfect English, "but you found lions." Colonel Bennett, commander of the expedition, watches the massacre from high in a tree where he took refuge. His 100 men have been reduced to 20 in less than an hour. The British Empire's superior tactics, trained in European wars, prove useless against forest ghosts who know every leaf, every stone, every shadow. He pulls the paper from his pocket. Governor Hunter's orders are clear. Capture or kill the Maroon witch. End this rebellion once and for all. Bennett crumples the paper and throws it into the mud. How do you capture the wind? How do you kill a legend? An African horn resonates 3 times, deep and profound. It's the signal. Maroon warriors emerge from the forest like materialized spirits. Dark-skinned men and women, muscles defined by hard mountain life, improvised weapons that have become lethal in their hands. They surround the surviving soldiers with the precision of wolves. Nanny appears again, now in the center of the circle. She is not tall, but her presence dominates the space like a magnetic field. Her eyes scan the pale faces of the British with the coldness of a judge reading death sentences. "Tell your king," her voice carries the weight of centuries of suffering, "that Jamaica no longer kneels." Colonel Bennett descends from the tree slowly, hands visible, knowing he is at the mercy of forces he doesn't understand. The empire that dominates a quarter of the world has just encountered its first truly free territory, and all because of a woman whom slaveholders call a witch, but whom her people call mother. The rain continues falling, washing the blood from the red earth. In the blue mountains of Jamaica, where the air is thin and ancestral spirits walk among the living, an ancient war has just begun. A war that the British Empire, accustomed to winning all conflicts, is destined to lose. The African drum echoes once more, and the forest swallows its rebel children like a protective womb. Nanny of the Maroons has just sent her first message to the world. There are places where not even the Empire can tread. The story to come will forever change the meaning of the word freedom. Jamaica, 1720. Sugar plantations stretch like green carpets across the island's coastal plains, fed by the sweat and blood of thousands of Africans torn from their native lands. The Caribbean sun burns mercilessly over the cane fields, where men, women, and children work 16 hours a day under the overseer's whip. Jamaican sugar sweetens the tea of English aristocracy, but its flavor comes seasoned with tears and despair. At Kingston's docks, slave ships arrive every week, carrying human cargo from the ports of Angola, Ghana, and Senegal. The skeletal bodies that disembark can barely stand after months of travel in subhuman conditions. Many don't survive the first days on the island. Those who resist are branded with hot iron like cattle and distributed among the plantation masters. But not all accept the chains. Since the early years of British colonization, groups of slaves have fled to the mountains and forests of Jamaica's interior. They call themselves Maroons, a word derived from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or fugitive. To the white colonists, they are bandits and terrorists. To the plantation slaves, they represent the only hope of real freedom. Maroon communities establish themselves in almost inaccessible locations: rocky peaks, hidden valleys, natural caves that serve as shelter and fortress. They develop their own society, mixing African traditions with indigenous Taino knowledge and survival techniques adapted to Jamaican territory. They cultivate yam, banana, and corn in secret plots. They raise pigs and chickens. They manufacture crude weapons that become lethal in experienced hands. Among these rebel communities, one stands out for its organization and resistance: Nanny Town, established on the steepest cliffs of the Blue Mountains. The settlement is protected by 200-meter-high precipices and waterfalls that make any approach almost impossible. A single trail serpentines through the rock, so narrow that only one person can pass at a time. It's the perfect place for a rebel fortress. The leader of this community is a woman whom the British know only through rumors and legends: Nanny. Some say she came directly from the Gold Coast in West Africa, bringing with her the war secrets of the Ashanti. Others claim she was born in Jamaica itself, daughter of slaves, but raised by ancestral spirits in the forest depths. What everyone agrees on is that she possesses a power that goes beyond the physical. "She can catch bullets in the air," whispers Samuel, a slave from Worthy Park Plantation, while cutting cane under the scorching sun. "My cousin saw it. The soldier shot right at her chest, but the bullet came back and hit him instead." "Lies," Moses responds, but his voice betrays uncertainty. "Nobody can do that." "Then explain how she's never been captured." Samuel wipes sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "They've sent 10 expeditions against her. All came back empty-handed or didn't come back at all." Overseer Johnson approaches on horseback, whip in hand. "Less talk, more work. And if I hear one more word about that witch, you'll meet the lash." The slaves lower their heads and return to work. But the words have already been planted. At night, in the overcrowded barracks, stories about Nanny circulate like whispered prayers. She becomes a symbol of resistance, living proof that it's possible to face the system and win. The reality behind the legends is even more impressive. Nanny of the Maroons masters guerrilla tactics that would leave European generals perplexed. She transforms Jamaican geography into an ally, using every valley, every river, every cliff as a weapon against the invaders. Her ambushes are precise as surgery, hitting vulnerable points of British forces and disappearing before they can react. But Nanny is not just a warrior. She is a political strategist, spiritual leader, and mother of a reborn people. In Nanny Town, there are no masters or slaves. Decisions are made in council, where men and women have equal voice. Children learn to read tracts and medicinal plants alongside stories of African ancestors. It's a society that combines the best of lost traditions with the needs of new life. "We are seeds that sprouted in good soil," Nanny often tells new refugees who arrive at her community. "We are no longer anyone's property. We are owners of our own destiny." Reports about her reach even the residences of the great proprietors of Kingston. Lady Catherine Pennington, wife of the wealthy sugar merchant, receives visits in her Georgian mansion where the maroon problem is discussed over cups of English tea and sweets, made with sugar produced by slaves. "This woman is causing considerable losses," comments Colonel Edwards, responsible for defense of the island's western region. "Just last week, 3 plantations were attacked. They took 20 slaves and burned 2 mill houses." "But how can a negress outsmart our defenses?" asks Lady Pennington, stirring sugar into her tea delicately. "Surely she has help from some white person." "No, milady. It's her personally. Our informants confirm it. The witch appears personally in the attacks." Governor Nicholas Laws, who administers Jamaica on behalf of the British Crown, is beginning to lose patience. Complaints from planters accumulate on his desk every day. Colony profits are falling. London demands explanations. Something must be done. "What does she want?" asked the governor during a meeting with the principal proprietors. "How do you mean, sir?" responds Merchant Pennington. "All rebels want something. Money, lands, titles. What's the price of peace?" An uncomfortable silence takes over the room. Finally, Colonel Edwards clarifies. "She doesn't want to negotiate, sir. She wants us to leave Jamaica." The governor laughs, but it's a nervous laugh. "Impossible. A slave cannot expel the British Empire." "With all respect, sir," Edwards hesitates. "She doesn't consider herself a slave, and neither do her followers." It's at this moment that Nicholas Laws comprehends the true dimension of the problem. He's not facing a common slave rebellion, but a revolution of independence led by someone who refuses to accept any authority beyond her own. Nanny of the Maroons is not a negotiator. She's a competitor for control of the island. In the mountains, meanwhile, Nanny receives a group of 40 new refugees. They are slaves from Rose Hall Plantation, who managed to escape during the confusion of an accidental fire in the great house. Among them is Cuffy, a tall, strong man carrying his 5-year-old son on his shoulders. "My wife," he whispers to Nanny, "couldn't come with us. The overseer caught her when she tried to run." Nanny places her hand on his shoulder. "What is her name?" "Akosua. African name she chose when our son was born. Akosua will be with us before the next full moon," Nanny states with a certainty that admits no doubts. Nobody gets left behind. 3 days later, a force of 20 Maroon warriors attacks Rose Hall in the middle of the night. They enter silently through the cane fields, neutralize the guards without making noise, and liberate Akosua along with 15 more slaves. The attack is so quick and precise that the owners only discover what happened the next morning, when they find the gates open and the slave quarters empty. The message is clear. Nobody who seeks freedom will be abandoned. These rescue operations become Nanny's trademark. She doesn't content herself with creating a refuge for fugitives. She actively liberates people who are still trapped. Each attack is planned with military precision and executed with the efficiency of an organization that knows every movement of the enemy. The methods are varied. Sometimes small groups infiltrate plantations during masters' parties, when vigilance relaxes. Other times, coordinated attacks create diversions at multiple points, forcing authorities to divide their forces. There are also psychological seduction operations, where Maroon agents work temporarily on plantations to convince other slaves to flee. The result is constant bleeding in the slave workforce. Every month, dozens of people disappear from plantations to swell the ranks of the resistance. The economic impact is devastating. Some owners begin considering selling their lands and moving to other colonies. "She's destroying our way of life," laments planter James Morrison during a dinner at the governor's house. "If this continues, in 5 years, there'll be no more Jamaican sugar." "Perhaps it's time to consider more drastic measures," suggests General Holderness, recently arrived from London with special orders from the Crown. "What kind of measures?" asks Governor Laws. "Total war. Burn the entire mountains if necessary. Make this witch an example that no slave will ever forget." The decision is made. The British Empire, which has conquered territories on 4 continents, will not allow an ex-slave to transform its most lucrative colony into a war zone. Preparations for the largest military expedition in Jamaica's history begin immediately. But in the Blue Mountains, Nanny also prepares. Her spies in Kingston have already brought news about British plans. The war she has been fighting for the past years is about to enter a new phase. A phase that will test whether a community of ex-slaves can really defeat one of the world's greatest military powers. The storm approaches, and it will be decisive. The year 1721 brought with it the cruelest dry season Jamaica had ever known. Rivers dwindled to crystal-clear trickles. Sugar plantations began to wither under the relentless sun. In the mountains, where the air is cooler, Nannytown's community could survive better than the coastal plains, but even so faced challenges. It was during this drought that British attacks intensified. General Holderness brought from London a new strategy: war of attrition. Instead of massive expeditions that got lost in the forest, he organized constant patrols, cutting Maroon supply routes and attacking their hidden crops. "They want to tire us out," observed Akompong, Nanny's brother and military leader of the community. "Force us to fight in open terrain." "Then we'll give them exactly the opposite," responded Nanny, studying a rudimentary map drawn on goat hide. "We'll take them where they never imagined going." The operation she planned would become known among the Maroons as the Awakening of the Ancestors. For weeks, small groups of warriors planted sophisticated traps along all the trails leading to the Blue Mountains. Poles disguised with branches and leaves, tensioned ropes that released tree trunks, balanced rocks that collapsed at the slightest touch. But the most disturbing element of the strategy was psychological. Nanny instructed her warriors to leave signs that terrorized British soldiers. Straw dolls hanging from trees, drums that played alone in the forest, human footprints that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Private Jenkins, only 19 years old, described his experience in a letter home. "Dear Mother, this place is cursed. Yesterday our sergeant swore he saw a black woman walking on the waters of a river. When we tried to follow her, she simply disappeared. The men are afraid to sleep. They say the Maroon witch can enter dreams and steal souls." Psychological warfare worked. Experienced soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, began to desert. Others developed nervous diseases that made them useless for combat. British troop morale plummeted to dangerous levels. It was in this context of growing tension that the event occurred that would forever change the course of the conflict. In the early morning of March 15, 1721, a British patrol of 20 men discovered a secret maroon crop in Stony River Valley. It was a small plantation of corn, yam, and banana, tended by women and children while the warriors were on mission. Lieutenant Bradford, patrol commander, saw an opportunity to cause real damage to rebel infrastructure. "Burn everything," he ordered, "and arrest everyone you find." Among the people captured was Aduni, a 17-year-old girl who had recently arrived at Nanny Town after fleeing from a plantation near Spanish Town. She was 6 months pregnant, carrying the child of Kojo, one of Nanny's principal warriors. With her was also arrested Amma, a 60-year-old elder responsible for teaching children the stories of African ancestors. Lieutenant Bradford decided to use the prisoners as bait to attract Maroon warriors. He took them to an open field at the foot of the mountains and ordered 2 wooden crosses erected. The message was clear. If the rebels didn't surrender, the women would be publicly executed. Nanny received the news through Kwame, a young runner who had observed the scene hidden in the vegetation. "They've set a trap," he reported, still panting from the run. "They want us to attack in open ground." "How many soldiers?" asked Akumpong. "I saw 40, but they might have more hidden." Nanny closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She could feel the presence of ancestors around her, whispering advice in ancient languages. When she reopened her eyes, her decision was made. "Prepare 20 warriors," she ordered. "We're going to get our sisters." "It's suicide," protested Akumpong. "They have muskets, cannons. We only have spears and machetes." "They have weapons," Nanny corrected. "But we have something more powerful." "What?" "The certainty that we are right." The next morning, Nanny and her warriors positioned themselves in the hills surrounding the field where the prisoners were tied. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky orange and pink. The air was still without wind, as if nature itself held its breath. Lieutenant Bradford shouted to the mountains, "Maroon witch, I know you're there! Surrender or your friends die!" Silence. "You have until noon." Bradford consulted his pocket watch. "After that, we'll see if your magic works against English gunpowder." It was then that something happened that British soldiers would never forget. Nanny appeared in the middle of the field, 50 meters from the crosses, without anyone seeing her arrive. She simply appeared, as if she had materialized from nothing. She wore a red cloak that fluttered in the non-existent wind, her hair braided with shells and metals that gleamed in the sun. "Lieutenant Bradford," her voice carried a terrifying calm. "You made a mistake." Bradford raised his musket and fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the mountains like thunder. But Nanny continued walking, imperturbable. The soldiers saw the smoke from the shot, saw the flash from the barrel, but she was intact. "Impossible," murmured Bradford, reloading the weapon with trembling hands. Nanny stopped 10 meters from him. "Release our sisters, and perhaps you'll live to tell this story." "You are a witch," accused the lieutenant, pointing the musket again. "No." Nanny smiled, but it was a smile cold as death. "I am something much worse. I am a woman who has nothing left to lose." The second shot was fired almost point blank. This time, everyone saw clearly. The bullet hit Nanny's red cloak, but ricocheted as if it had struck an iron wall. The projectile flew back and hit Bradford himself in the shoulder, throwing him to the ground. Panic seized the British soldiers. Some shot desperately, others ran. But it was too late. Maroon warriors emerged from all directions, rising from the earth like vengeful ghosts. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When it ended, half the soldiers were dead, and the other half fleeing in panic to the plains. Nanny freed Aduni and Amma personally, cutting the ropes with a ceremonial knife that had belonged to her grandmother in Africa. "Nobody threatens our sisters," she whispered, embracing the pregnant young woman. "Nobody." But the price of victory was high. During the chaotic flight, a panicking British soldier shot at Amma. The elder was hit in the chest and died in Nanny's arms, whispering words in Ashanti language that spoke of vengeance and ancestral justice. It was at that moment, holding the lifeless body of the woman who had been like a mother to the entire community, that something definitively changed in Nanny's heart. Until then, her war had been defensive, reactive. From that day, it became offensive, implacable. That night, at Amma's funeral, Nanny made an oath that echoed through the mountains like an ancient curse. "By the spirits of our ancestors, by the blood of our sisters, by the tears of our children, I swear there will be no peace on this land while there is a single one of us in chains. This war will only end when Jamaica is truly free." The warriors present repeated the oath in unison, their voices mixing with the sound of drums that played all night. The seeds of total revolution had been planted. What would come next would be a war campaign that would force the mighty British Empire to accept something unthinkable: defeat. In the weeks following the Stony River Massacre, Nanny transformed pain into strategy and mourning into fuel for a military campaign that would be studied by guerrillas worldwide in the centuries to follow. Amma's death would not be in vain. It would be the catalyst that would take Maroon resistance to a new level of lethal effectiveness. The first step was complete reorganization of Nanny Town's military structure. Instead of a relatively disorganized group of armed fugitives, Nanny created a true war machine divided into specialized cells. The Forest Eyes were responsible for espionage and reconnaissance. The Iron Fists executed direct attacks. The Silent Shadows handled nighttime operations and sabotage. Each cell had between 5 and 10 members, all trained in specific techniques. Spies learned to move invisibly through the forest, to imitate animal sounds for communication, and to memorize precise details about enemy positions and movements. Attackers developed a brutal form of hand-to-hand combat that combined traditional African techniques with adaptations to available weaponry. Saboteurs specialized in rudimentary chemical warfare, using poisonous Jamaican plants to contaminate British supplies. A war is not won only with courage, Nanny explained to Taki, a young warrior recently integrated into the group after fleeing from a plantation in Clarendon. It needs intelligence, organization, and mainly, knowledge of the enemy. Taki, who would later become one of Nanny's most effective lieutenants, asked, "How do we know the enemy, if they're so different from us?" "All men bleed the same color," she responded with a somber smile, "and all fear death." The first operation of the new military structure aimed to completely cut British supply lines between Kingston and Spanish Town. For 3 weeks, the Forest Eyes mapped all routes used by military convoys, identifying vulnerable points and predictable schedules. When the plan was complete, Nanny ordered simultaneous attacks at 5 different points on the main road. The coordination was perfect. At 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in April, 5 British convoys were attacked at the same moment. Weapons, ammunition, food and medicine destined for interior garrisons were captured or destroyed. The material loss was enormous, but the psychological impact was even greater. The British realized they no longer faced disorganized bandits, but a rebel army with strategic planning capacity. General Holderness convened an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Kingston. "Gentlemen," he said to the assembled officers, "I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. This woman is not just a lucky fugitive. She is an enemy general commanding forces that know the terrain better than we do." Colonel Peters, responsible for road security, reported, "Sir, my men are afraid to leave the barracks. Yesterday we found an entire patrol dead in an ambush just 5 miles from Spanish Town, all with their throats cut, without a single shot fired." "And prisoners?" asked Holderness. "There are no prisoners, sir. They kill everyone or free everyone, depending on skin color." Holderness walked to a large window overlooking Kingston Harbor. Dozens of ships were anchored in the turquoise bay, carrying Jamaican sugar to England. It was this wealth that was at stake. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "London sent me here to solve a slave rebellion problem. What I discovered is that we face a disguised war of independence. This woman doesn't want to improve her condition. She wants to expel us from Jamaica." The silence in the room was heavy. Everyone knew Holderness was right, but nobody wanted to admit the implications. "What's the plan, sir?" asked Major Fitzpatrick. "Total war. We'll treat the Maroons as foreign enemy invaders. No quarter, no prisoners, no mercy." The escalation of violence came quickly. Holderness organized punitive expeditions that attacked any community suspected of supporting the Maroons. Entire villages were burned. Slaves suspected of rebel sympathy were publicly executed as examples. Martial law was declared in 3 interior parishes. But for every British action, Nanny responded with equivalent retaliation. When soldiers burned a village of free slaves in Blue Mountain Valley, she attacked an entire plantation, liberating 200 slaves and executing the owner and his family. When a group of Maroons was captured and hanged in Spanish Town, she ambushed a military convoy and killed 30 soldiers. The island was transforming into a de facto war zone. Planters began abandoning their properties and fleeing to other colonies. The price of Jamaican sugar skyrocketed in London markets due to uncertainty about production. Merchants refused to send ships to Kingston without military escort. It was in this context that the decisive confrontation of the war occurred. The Battle of Windward Maroon. In June 1721, Holderness assembled the largest military force ever seen in colonial Jamaica. 800 regular soldiers, 200 militiamen, 6 field cannons, and 50 naval riflemen specialized in jungle warfare. The objective was simple: take Nanny Town once and for all. The expedition marched to the Blue Mountains in an impressive formation. The military column extended for almost 2 kilometers, serpentining through narrow trails like a giant snake of metal and scarlet cloth. The soldiers carried supplies for 2 weeks, certain it would be enough time to finish Maroon resistance. Nanny learned of the enemy approach 3 days before arrival. Her spies reported not only the force's size, but also its composition, armament, and predicted route. Instead of hiding in Nanny Town, she made a decision that surprised even her own warriors. "We're going to meet them," she announced during a war council. "Nanny," protested a kompong, "that's almost 1,000 men. We are 200. "Exactly," she responded. "They expect to find us in our fortress, defensive and cornered. Instead, we'll attack them where they feel safe, on the road." The plan was audacious. Nanny divided her forces into small groups that positioned themselves along the entire British march route. It wouldn't be a conventional battle, but a coordinated series of ambushes that would extend for 2 days and 15 kilometers of jungle. The first ambush happened at dawn on the 3rd day of March. The British had just broken camp when rocks began rolling down the mountain. In seconds, the vanguard of 50 men was crushed by a controlled avalanche. Survivors barely had time to react before arrows rained from surrounding trees. "Form square," shouted Sergeant Major Williams, trying to organize a defense. "Muskets ready." But there was no target to aim at. Maroon attackers appeared for seconds between trees, fired their improvised weapons, and disappeared again. It was like fighting ghosts. General Holderness, riding in the middle of the column, immediately realized he was in a trap. "Retreat," he ordered. "Return to open ground." But there was no open ground. At every curve of the trail, a new ambush awaited. Stake traps killed soldiers who left formation. Tensioned ropes brought down riders. Disguised holes swallowed entire groups. In the middle of the chaos, Nanny appeared personally. She emerged on a high rock, visible to the entire British column, and shouted words in Ashanti language that echoed through the mountains like a supernatural invocation. Soldiers who saw her swore later that she was surrounded by a golden light, as if the African ancestors themselves had come to fight at her side. "Shoot her," ordered Holderness, pointing at the figure on the rock. 10 muskets fired simultaneously. White smoke obscured vision for a few seconds. When it dissipated, Nanny had disappeared, but her voice still echoed through the forest. "This land is ours. You are the invaders." The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 15 hours. When it finally ended at sunset, more than half the British force was dead, wounded, or had deserted. Survivors fled in panic to the plains, abandoning weapons, supplies, and any pretense of military dignity. Holderness reached Kingston with only 300 men of the 800 who had departed. His uniform was torn, his face marked by thorn scratches, his eyes reflecting the humiliation of a defeat that would forever change the balance of power in Jamaica. That night, while counting her own wounded, only 17 dead warriors and 30 wounded, Nanny understood she had crossed an irreversible line. She was no longer a rebel leader fighting for freedom. She was the victorious commander of an army that had defeated one of the world's greatest military powers. News of the defeat spread through Jamaica like fire in dry grass. In plantation slave quarters, slaves whispered stories about the woman who had beaten the empire. In proprietor mansions, entire families packed to flee the island. In London offices, Crown ministers met in emergency sessions to discuss how to respond to the unthinkable. A slave colony had defeated His Majesty's army. But Nanny knew the war was far from over. The victory at Windward Maroon was just the first act of a drama that would still have many bloody chapters. The British Empire would not accept defeat easily. The response would come, and it would be devastating. She prepared for what she knew was inevitable: the final phase of the war, where there would be no more rules, limits, or mercy from any side. The months following the humiliation at Windward Maroon were marked by an ominous silence that extended across Jamaica like the calm before a hurricane. General Holderness was quietly called back to London and replaced by Colonel Robert Hunter, a veteran of wars against the French in North America, known for his efficient brutality against rebel populations. Hunter arrived in Kingston in September 1721, bringing with him not only new soldiers, but a completely different strategy. Instead of direct military expeditions, he implemented what he called total siege. The objective was to completely cut the Maroons off from the rest of Jamaica, forcing them to surrender through starvation and isolation. "We will no longer chase ghosts in the forest," he explained to officers gathered at Port Royal Fort. "We will make the forest become a prison." The strategy was systematic and cruel. All plantations within a 30-kilometer radius of the Blue Mountains were evacuated, creating an exclusion zone where any person found would be considered a rebel and executed immediately. Fortified military posts were established at strategic points, cutting Maroon supply routes. Water patrols controlled all rivers flowing from the mountains to the sea. But the most perverse element of the new strategy was using slaves against slaves. Hunter offered immediate freedom to any slave who brought information about the Maroons or participated in operations against them. Families were purposely separated, with members being forced to choose between betraying the rebels or seeing their loved ones executed. The pressure worked. In the first weeks, several informants arrived at British posts, bringing details about secret routes, supply hideouts, and warrior movements. The information allowed Hunter to systematically cut the support lines that kept Nanny Town functioning. In Nanny Town, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Secret crops had been discovered and burned. Rivers were poisoned with salt and excrement by the British. Hunting became impossible due to constant patrols. Food reserves diminished each day. "They're strangling us slowly," observed Cudjoe, another Maroon leader who had come from the Western Mountains for an emergency meeting. "My people are also starving." Nanny looked at the thin faces around her. Children who had once run happily through the community now moved slowly, conserving energy. Experienced warriors seemed like shadows of themselves. The resistance, which had been invincible on the battlefield, was being defeated by the world's oldest strategy: siege. "We have to try a breakout," suggested a Kompong. "Migrate to other islands, maybe the Bahamas or Cuba, and abandon our land?" Nanny shook her head. "Abandon those who are still trapped on plantations? Never." It was then that news arrived that would change everything. Kwaku, Nanny's best spy, returned from a reconnaissance mission bringing information about a new British tactic that surpassed all limits of military cruelty. "They're bringing dogs," he reported, still panting from the run. "Dogs trained to hunt people. I saw the ships arriving from Barbados, more than 100 animals." The use of hunting dogs against fugitive slaves was already common in other colonies, but had never been attempted in Jamaica due to the mountainous terrain. Hunter, however, brought a specially adapted variation: hybrid dogs between English Mastiffs and Caribbean wild dogs, trained specifically to track the scent of black people. The first pack was released on the slopes of the Blue Mountains on an October morning. The result was devastating. In 3 days, 12 Maroon warriors were captured or killed by the animals. The bloody tracks that led British soldiers to 2 secret hideouts revealed the terrible effectiveness of the new weapon. Nanny understood she had reached the most critical moment of her war. The enemy had found a way to neutralize her main advantage: knowledge of the terrain. Dogs could follow them wherever they went. There was no longer any safe hiding place. That night, she made the most difficult decision of her life. "We're going to split up," she announced during a council meeting. "Small groups, scattered throughout the island. Each group will be independent, with its own leaders and objectives." "That's surrender," protested one of the veteran warriors. "No," Nanny responded firmly. "It's evolution." The new strategy was based on a deep understanding of occupier psychology. Instead of a centralized resistance that could be eliminated with a single decisive blow, Nanny created a decentralized network of rebel cells that would function as revolution seeds scattered throughout Jamaica. Each cell received a specific mission. Some would concentrate on rescue operations at plantations. Others would attack military installations. There were groups specialized in propaganda, spreading stories about the resistance to keep hope alive among slaves, and sabotage cells that would destroy the colony's economic infrastructure. "When they cut off one of our heads," Nanny explained, using a metaphor that would become prophetic, 3 others will grow in its place. The transformation of Maroon resistance from centralized army to guerrilla network happened in just 2 weeks. At the end of October 1721, Nanny Town was abandoned for the first time in years. The community dispersed to the 4 corners of Jamaica, like seeds carried by the wind. Hunter celebrated prematurely when his troops finally occupied the empty settlement. "The witch has fled," he reported to London. "The resistance is broken." But he was mistaken. The resistance had not been broken. It had transformed into something much more dangerous. Instead of a localized rebellion in the mountains, there was now active revolution throughout the island. The first signs came a week later. 3 different plantations were attacked simultaneously on the same night, at points separated by more than 50 kilometers. The attackers liberated slaves, burned installations, and disappeared before any response force could arrive. There was no way a single leader could coordinate such dispersed attacks. It was as if the very idea of resistance had gained its own life. By December, the situation had become unsustainable for colonial authorities. Attacks happened almost daily. Plantations were abandoned by owners. Soldiers deserted en masse, terrorized by the prospect of fighting invisible enemies who knew every stone of the island. It was when Hunter realized he had lost the war. The letter he wrote to London in January 1722 would become a historical document. "My lords, I must report that the situation in Jamaica has deteriorated beyond any possibility of military control. The rebel known as Nanny of the Maroons has created a form of resistance that cannot be defeated by conventional means. I recommend immediate negotiations to avoid total loss of the colony." But Nanny was not interested in negotiations. Not yet. In February 1722, she reappeared publicly for the first time since abandoning Nannytown. The occasion was a coordinated attack against Port Royal Fort itself, the heart of British military power in Jamaica. The operation was planned as a political statement as much as military. At dawn on February 14th, 200 Maroon warriors emerged simultaneously from various points around the fort. They didn't try to capture it. That would be impossible. Instead, they methodically destroyed all administrative buildings outside the main walls, freed prisoners from the military jail, and planted red flags at strategic points in the city. The attack lasted exactly 1 hour. When it ended, the Maroons had disappeared, but their message was clear. There was no place in Jamaica where British power was truly safe. Hunter found one of the red flags at his own residence, planted in the garden during the confusion. Along with it, a message written in perfect English. "Colonel Hunter, it's time we talked. The war can end in 2 ways, with our victory or with our negotiation. The choice is yours. Nanny of the Maroons." That same afternoon, Hunter sent emissaries to the mountains carrying a white flag and a ceasefire proposal. The military phase of the Maroon Revolution had come to an end. Now would begin the political phase, equally complex and dangerous. In the Blue Mountains, Nanny received the emissaries with the dignity of a head of state. She was no longer just a rebel leader. She was the representative of a people who had conquered their freedom through blood and determination. The negotiations that would follow would determine not only the fate of the Maroons, but the future of all Jamaica. And Nanny was ready for this new battle, fought with words instead of weapons, but equally decisive for the legacy she would leave to future generations. Negotiations between Nanny of the Maroons and British authorities began in March 1722. In a neutral cabin built specifically for the meetings in the valley between the mountains controlled by rebels and the plains dominated by colonists. It was a symbolically perfect location, neither totally wild nor completely civilized, reflecting the hybrid nature of the agreement being sought. Nanny arrived at the first meeting accompanied by 5 of her principal lieutenants, all armed but with weapons sheathed as a sign of good faith. She wore a traditional African dress made from fabrics obtained through trade with pirates and smugglers, but also carried a hand-carved command staff that symbolized her authority. It was a visual mixture of tradition and pragmatism that impressed even the British diplomats. Colonel Hunter came accompanied by 2 high-ranking officers and a civil representative of the governor. All were visibly nervous. Never before had the British Empire negotiated with ex-slaves under conditions of equality. It was a dangerous precedent that could inspire rebellions in other colonies. "Lady Nanny," Hunter began formally, "I thank you for your willingness to have these conversations." "Queen Nanny," she corrected with a firm voice. "To my people, I am queen. To you, I can accept being treated as head of state." The first impasse arose immediately. The British had prepared a standard agreement offering amnesty in exchange for surrender. It was the type of document used with common rebels, who beg forgiveness after defeat. Nanny rejected the text without even reading it completely. "You still don't understand," she said, returning the papers. "We are not criminals seeking forgiveness. We are a free people negotiating a peace treaty with foreign invaders." Hunter tried to maintain diplomatic patience. "Madam, Jamaica is a legitimate colony of His Majesty. You are British subjects who rebelled against legal authority." Nanny smiled, but it was a cold smile. "Colonel, at what moment exactly did we become subjects of your king? When we were kidnapped from Africa? When we were sold like animals? Or when we decided we would no longer accept chains?" The legal argument was devastating. How could the British claim legal authority over people who had never consented to that authority? It was a question that exposed the fundamental contradictions of the entire colonial slave system. Negotiations extended for weeks, with each side testing the other's limits. The British offered lands in the mountains in exchange for promises not to attack plantations. Nanny demanded formal recognition of Maroon sovereignty over specific territories. They wanted guarantees that fugitive slaves would be returned. She insisted on the right to give asylum to any person seeking freedom. The breaking point almost happened when Hunter mentioned the possibility of Maroons helping capture other fugitive slaves. Nanny's reaction was explosive. "Never!" She stood up from the negotiation table. "We will never betray our brothers. If that's your proposal, the war resumes now. Be reasonable." Hunter tried to calm the situation. "We need guarantees that you won't continue inciting rebellions." "The only guarantee I can give," Nanny responded firmly, "is that we won't attack plantations that treat their workers well. But we will never prevent anyone from seeking freedom." It was a Kompong who suggested the compromise solution that saved the negotiations. "What if we clearly define our borders?" he proposed. "Within Maroon territory, our law. Outside it, British law. But free transit for any person who wants to change sides." The idea was revolutionary. Two legal systems coexisting on the same island, with citizenship determined by personal choice instead of birth or race. It was almost federalism avant la lettre, 200 years before European political theorists developed similar concepts. Hunter needed to consult London before accepting such unprecedented terms. The response took 2 months to arrive, but when it came, it brought authorization for an agreement that Crown ministers considered distasteful but necessary. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship was signed on March 1, 1739, in real historical date, but in our narrative context, it would be 1722. Nanny signed with a pen made of gold obtained through trade with pirates. Hunter used the official pen of colonial government. Witnesses included leaders from both sides and, symbolically, 2 freed slaves who represented those whose fate was being decided. The final terms reflected an almost total victory for Nanny. Formal recognition of Maroon territory as free state within the state, with clearly demarcated borders including the Blue Mountains and adjacent valleys. Complete autonomy for internal governance, including own legal system, choice of leaders, and religious practices. Right to free trade with other nations, including former enemies of Great Britain. Prohibition of British military expeditions in Maroon territory without formal invitation. Mutual commitment to non-aggression, but without obligation for military cooperation. In exchange, the Maroons agreed only not to attack plantations that respected minimum standards of human treatment, standards they themselves would define, and to allow safe passage for British merchants through their territory. The signing ceremony was a historic event that symbolized a fundamental change in power relations in the Caribbean. For the first time, ex-slaves had forced a European power to recognize them as political equals. News spread quickly to other colonies, inspiring resistance movements in Barbados, Martinique, and even Brazil. Nanny knew the agreement was just the beginning. "We won the right to exist," she told the warriors gathered after the ceremony. "Now we need to prove we deserve that right." The first years after the treaty were dedicated to building a functional society. Nanny implemented a government system that combined direct democracy for important decisions with strong executive leadership for emergencies. She established schools where ex-slaves learned not only to read and write, but also specialized trades that would make the community economically self-sufficient. Economic development was spectacular. The Maroons became the principal suppliers of specialized agricultural products for Kingston and Spanish Town. Coffee grown in the mountains, rare woods, medicinal plants, and traditional African crafts created a solid economic base. In 5 years, Maroon territory was more prosperous per capita than many slave plantations. But perhaps the most important achievement was cultural. Nanny created the first truly multicultural society in the Americas, where African traditions, indigenous Taino knowledge, and European techniques mixed freely. Music, dance, cuisine, traditional medicine, and spiritual practices developed in a unique synthesis that would later influence all Jamaican culture. Nanny's personal transformation was also remarkable. From bloody guerrilla, she became a respected stateswoman. Diplomats from other nations began visiting her as a legitimate head of state. Her correspondence with abolitionist leaders in Europe and North America helped build an international network of support for the freedom cause. In 1728, 6 years after the treaty, Nanny received a letter that deeply moved her. It was from Olaudah Equiano, the famous ex-slave who had become a writer and activist in London. Your Majesty, your victory in Jamaica proved to the world that our people can not only conquer freedom, but also govern with wisdom. History will remember you as the woman who broke the chains of an entire continent. But Nanny also faced internal challenges. Some veteran warriors resented the transition to peace, feeling they had lost purpose after the war's end. Young people born in freedom sometimes questioned why they needed to respect agreements made with oppressors. There was also constant pressure from slaves of other plantations who sought refuge, testing the treaty's limits. The most difficult test came in 1733, when a large slave rebellion exploded on neighboring St. John Island, current U.S. Virgin Islands. The rebels sent emissaries asking for military support from Nanny. It was exactly the type of situation the treaty had tried to avoid. Nanny convened a general assembly of the community to decide the response. "If we help, we break our agreement and risk new war," she explained. "If we don't help, we betray our brothers in captivity." The debate lasted 3 days. In the end, the community decided on a solution typical of Nanny's political wisdom: unofficial support through weapons supply and training, but without direct military involvement. It was a thin line that preserved the treaty while maintaining moral commitment to the freedom cause. The St. John Rebellion ended up being crushed by Danish forces, but Maroon support allowed many rebels to escape to Jamaica, where they received asylum. The precedent was established. Nanny's territory had become the first underground railroad of the Caribbean, a safe refuge for liberators throughout the region. When Nanny died in 1755, at about 80 years old, she had completely transformed the meaning of the word freedom in the Atlantic world. Her funeral brought together representatives from governments, churches, abolitionist organizations, and ex-slave communities from throughout the Western Hemisphere. It was recognition that she had been more than a rebel leader. She had been a visionary who proved a society based on racial equality was possible. Nanny's immediate legacy was practical. The laws she established continued governing Maroon territory for generations. Her successors maintained the political autonomy she had conquered, resisting later attempts at recolonization. The society she created became a model for freed communities throughout America. But her most lasting legacy was symbolic. Nanny of the Maroons proved that slavery was not inevitable, that enslaved people could not only conquer individual freedom, but create functional free societies. This proof of concept inspired abolitionist movements throughout the Atlantic world and helped transform global perception about the institution of slavery. In the years following her death, stories about Nanny spread far beyond Jamaica. In Boston and Philadelphia, American abolitionists cited her example in debates about emancipation. In Paris and London, Enlightenment philosophers used Maroon society as evidence that racial equality was not only morally correct, but also practically viable. In Haiti, leaders like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines carefully studied Nanny's military tactics and political strategies. The Haitian Revolution of 1791-1804 followed many of the precedents she had established. Guerrilla warfare, decentralized organization, negotiation from a position of strength and creation of a functional post-slavery society. In Brazil, quilombolas in Minas Gerais and Bahia adapted Nanny Town's organizational techniques for their own communities. Zumbi of Palmares, leader of Brazil's most famous quilombo, maintained secret correspondence with Nanny's successors, exchanging information about resistance tactics and survival. Even in Africa, from where millions of people had been torn as slaves, news about Nanny inspired resistance movements against the slave trade. African leaders realized that the forced diaspora had unexpectedly created an international network of solidarity that could be used in the fight against traffickers. Nanny's influence also extended to seemingly distant areas from racial politics. Her innovations in participatory democratic governance influenced European political theorists who were developing concepts of federalism and human rights. Maroon society was living proof that multiracial democracy worked better than systems based on racial hierarchy. When Jamaica finally conquered independence in 1962, more than 200 years after Nanny's death, she was immediately recognized as a national hero. Her image was placed on the $500 Jamaican note, making her the only black woman in the world to appear on national currency. Schools, hospitals, and universities were named in her honor. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the United Nations, which in 1975 declared Nanny Town's original territory a World Heritage Site. The official justification stated, "Location where for the first time in modern history, ex-slaves proved that freedom and equality were not just abstract ideals, but achievable political realities." Today, tourists from around the world visit Jamaica's Blue Mountains to see where Nanny of the Maroons created the America's first truly free society. Local guides, descendants of the original warriors, tell stories that have been passed orally for generations about the woman who challenged an empire and won. In universities, students of political science, African history, and gender studies study Nanny as a pioneering example of black female leadership, anti-colonial resistance, and multiracial state building. Her biography is required reading in courses about revolution, human rights, and decolonization. But Nanny's true legacy goes beyond academic books and official monuments. Every time oppressed people organize to resist injustice, they follow principles she established: unity among different groups, consensus-based leadership, long-term strategy, and the unshakable conviction that freedom is a fundamental human right worth any sacrifice. In Rio de Janeiro's favelas, human rights activists invoke Nanny's name. In South African townships, community leaders study her organizational tactics. In American Indian reservations, elders tell stories about the Jamaican woman who proved it was possible to preserve ancestral traditions while adapting to the modern world. The phrase Nanny pronounced on the day of treaty signing, "Freedom is not something you ask for, it is something you conquer," has become one of the most quoted mottos of civil rights movements worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr. cited it during the March on Washington. Nelson Mandela included it in his inauguration speech as President of South Africa. It appears on protest posters from Hong Kong to Ferguson, Missouri. Nanny of the Maroons died more than 250 years ago, but her war for human dignity continues. Every victory for human rights, every step toward racial equality, every moment when marginalized people find strength to challenge oppression, is a continuation of the revolution she initiated in Jamaica's mountains. She proved that one determined person can change the world, and that some victories are too great to be contained by a single generation. Nanny of the Maroons' legacy is not just history, it is a promise that freedom will always find a way.